The night my father came home from the hospital, I was the one who drove 3 hours to pick him up. My husband didn't offer. He said he had a site visit he couldn't reschedule. I said okay. I always said okay. My father had just had a stent put in. His cardiologist at the Foothills Medical Center had been very clear: no stairs for at least a week, no cooking, no lifting, no being alone for the first 72 hours. My parents' house in Red Deer didn't have a main floor bedroom. Ours did. It had a guest room that nobody used except to store my husband's camping gear and a box of hockey equipment he hadn't touched since before we got married. I called my husband on the drive home and told him my father would need to stay with us for about 5 days, maybe a week. There was a pause on the line that lasted a beat too long. How long exactly? I just told you, 5 days, maybe 7. That's a long time, Ren. Ren. That's me. Short for Ren, which my mother chose because she said I came into the world quiet and small and watchful. I've spent most of my adult life trying not to live up to it. He just had heart surgery, I said. It was a stent. It's a routine procedure. I didn't say anything. I knew if I spoke right then, I would say something that couldn't be unsaid on a hands-free call while merging onto the QE2. I'm not saying he can't stay, my husband said quickly. I'm just saying it would have been nice to be asked. You're right, I said. I'm asking now. I guess that's fine. I guess that's fine. Those 4 words settled somewhere in my chest like something small and cold. My father arrived at our house in Calgary walking slowly, with a bruise on his wrist from the IV and a plastic bag of discharge papers from the nurse. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. He looked smaller. He stood in the front hallway in his coat and looked around our house like he was trying to take up as little space as possible, and I thought, this man built a deck onto the back of his house with his own hands when I was 9. This man drove me to every volleyball practice for 3 years and never once complained about the ice on the roads. My husband shook his hand and said, "Good to have you, Gary," in the voice he used for client calls. My father said thank you and meant it. The first 2 days were fine. My husband was at work most of the time, and my father and I watched old hockey games on Sportsnet, and I made him oatmeal in the mornings and soup from scratch in the evenings, and he slept in the guest room which I had cleared out entirely, relocated the camping gear to the garage, folded the hockey equipment into a bin. My father said he felt bad about putting me out. I told him he wasn't putting me out. That was true. On the third morning, my husband came downstairs before my father was awake and poured himself a coffee and said, without looking at me, "Is he going to be watching TV all day again?" "He's recovering from a cardiac procedure." "I know what he's recovering from. I'm just asking if there's a timeline." The cardiologist said a week. Right. He took his coffee and went back upstairs to get dressed. That evening, my father was sitting in the living room watching the news when my husband came home from work. My husband said a brief hello, went to the kitchen, and then said to me, quietly, while my father was still in earshot, "I'd really like to have dinner without the TV on." I went to the living room. "Dad, do you want to come eat at the table?" My father looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression he'd had when I was 16, and he drove 45 minutes in a snowstorm to pick me up from a party I hadn't told him about, and he hadn't said a single word the whole drive home, and I hadn't known if that was better or worse than being yelled at. "I'm okay in here," he said. "Are you sure? There's plenty of room." "I don't want to intrude." Those words, "I don't want to intrude." My father, who had never in his life made anyone feel unwelcome in his home, who had housed my cousin for 6 months after her separation without a single complaint, who had let my high school best friend sleep on the pull-out sofa for 2 weeks when her parents were fighting, my father, sitting in my guest room with a bruised wrist and a heart full of new metal, saying he didn't want to intrude. I sat down beside him on the couch. "You're not intruding, Dad." He patted my hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He left on day 6. His neighbor picked him up. A retired teacher named Walt, who had known my parents for 30 years and who brought my father a casserole and a National Geographic and acted like it was the most natural thing in the world to drive an hour and a half on a Tuesday afternoon because his friend needed a ride home. I stood in the driveway and watched his neighbor's truck pull out of the cul-de-sac, and I felt something I couldn't name. Not sadness exactly, something closer to shame. That night, my husband said, "It was good of you to have him." I said, "He's my father." "I know. I just meant it was a lot, for both of us." I nodded. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about the way my father had said, "I don't want to intrude," and I thought about the 6 days that had just passed, and I counted very carefully the number of times my husband had asked how my father was feeling. Once, on the first day in the car where I could hear him. In November, my husband told me his mother was coming for the holidays. Not asking, telling. "She's flying in from Halifax on the 22nd, he said. "She'll stay through New Year's." That's 10 days. I did the math immediately, automatically, the way you do when you already know the number is going to bother you. 10 days, I said. She hasn't seen the house since we renovated, and she's getting older, Ren. I want her to have a real Christmas. I thought about my father's bruised wrist. I guess that's fine. "Of course," I said. "That sounds great." And I meant to mean it. I genuinely tried to mean it. My mother-in-law arrived on a Sunday afternoon with 2 checked bags and a carry-on and a set of opinions about our kitchen renovation that she began sharing in the driveway. "The stone's a bit cold," she said, looking at the countertop through the window before she'd even taken off her coat. "But it photographs well." My husband laughed. "She's a real estate agent," he said to me, as if I didn't know, as if I hadn't known for 7 years. "It's lovely," I said, because I'd learned that the safest response was always a noun and an adjective with nothing attached. She took the guest room. Of course she did. I had changed the sheets the day before, bought the good soap from the Sage on 17th. Put a little dish of individually wrapped chocolates on the nightstand because I'd read somewhere that it made guests feel welcome. She put her bags down and looked around and said, "Is there somewhere I can hang my things properly? The closet in Halifax has a proper system." I put a second rod in the closet that evening while my husband and his mother sat in the living room watching the Christmas special on CBC. The first 3 days, I cooked every meal. Not because anyone asked me to, because it became clear very quickly that the expectation existed without needing to be spoken. My husband would come into the kitchen while I was making dinner and say things like, "Mom mentioned she doesn't do well with too much garlic," or "Do you have to use wine in that? She doesn't drink anymore," or once, memorably, "Could you maybe do something a bit more festive? It's Christmas." I made a roast chicken on day 3. Bought it from Spalumbo's, spent $40 on a heritage bird, made a proper pan gravy, roasted carrots and parsnips, made a salad with the good olive oil. My mother-in-law ate about 6 bites and said she'd had a late lunch. That night, I scraped most of the chicken into containers and put them in the fridge, and my husband said nothing. And I stood at the sink washing the roasting pan and thought about the soup I'd made from scratch for my father and how he'd asked for the recipe. By day 5, something in me had gone very quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, the kind that means something underneath has started moving. My mother-in-law had opinions about everything. The way I loaded the dishwasher, the thread count of the towels. She mentioned it twice, which I know because I counted. She rearranged the items on the bathroom shelf while I was at work, and when I came home and noticed, I put them back exactly as they had been, and the next morning, they'd been moved again. She talked about my husband's ex-girlfriend 3 times in 5 days, not maliciously, just casually, the way you mention someone who still exists in the world to you, which felt like its own kind of message. And my husband who had sighed at the presence of my father in our home, who had asked about timelines, who had wanted dinner without the television on. My husband was transformed. He laughed loudly. He made reservations at River Cafe without asking if I wanted to come. He watched old home videos on his laptop with his mother at the kitchen table while I made breakfast 3 feet away. He was attentive and generous and warm, and I watched it all from the other side of the kitchen island and felt like a contractor who'd built the house and then been asked to use the service entrance. On day 6, he came to me with an expression I'd seen before. It was his negotiating expression. He wore it when he was about to ask for something he already knew the answer to. Mom was wondering, he said, if you could maybe take her to Cross Iron Mills tomorrow. She wants to do some shopping before Christmas. Cross Iron Mills is 45 minutes north of the city. On a weekday in December, it's probably an hour with traffic. I have work, I said. You could take the afternoon. I have a 3 o'clock call with a client in Toronto. Can you reschedule it? I looked at him. He looked back at me with absolute seriousness. I'll see what I can do, I said. I rescheduled my call. I drove his mother to the mall. I sat outside Reitman's for 25 minutes while she looked at sweaters. I bought a gingerbread latte I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. On the drive back, she told me about her son's childhood in Halifax and how hard it had been for him when they moved, and how sensitive he'd always been, and how she'd always worried about him. And I nodded and said, and drove through the dark and the snow on Deerfoot Trail and thought about my father sitting in my guest room saying he didn't want to intrude. When we got home, my husband had made dinner. Not for me. He'd ordered in from a Thai place his mother liked and set the table beautifully and opened a nice bottle of BC Pinot Noir. And when I walked in the door with my coat still on, he said, "Oh, we went ahead and started. Yours is in the kitchen." I stood in the doorway for a moment. There was a plate on the counter, not the dining room table. The counter. "Thanks," I said. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room and I thought very clearly, with a kind of calm I hadn't expected, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I didn't do it that night. I didn't do it dramatically either. That's the part I want to be clear about, because I've told this story a few times now and people always expect the big confrontation. The door slamming, the speech. That's not how it happened. What happened was, the next morning, I called my mother. She lives in Red Deer, 40 minutes from my dad, in the house I grew up in. She'd been alone since Thanksgiving because her sister in Moncton had been having a hard time and she'd flown out to help and only just gotten back. "Mom," I said, "how are you?" "I'm fine," she said, a little tired. "Why? What's going on?" "I was thinking about coming to see you before Christmas." Pause. "You don't usually come before Christmas." "I know. I thought maybe we could do some baking, watch something. I don't know. I just want to see you." There was a longer pause, and then my mother said, in the voice she uses when she knows something but isn't going to push it, "When do you want to come?" "Tomorrow," I said, "if that's okay." "It's always okay." I told my husband at breakfast. His mother was still upstairs. I waited until it was just us. "I'm going to Red Deer tomorrow," I said, "to see my mom. I'll be back on the 24th. He set down his coffee. "That's 4 days from now." "Yes." "My mom is here." "I know." "You're going to leave while she's here." "She's your mom," I said. "You can take care of her. You know where everything is." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him loading something up, preparing a response, reaching for the frame where I was being unreasonable, where this was about something I was inventing or exaggerating. I'd seen him do it before. He was good at it. "Is this about your dad?" he said finally. "No," I said. "This is about my mom." Which was true. That was the whole truth. I wanted to see my mother. I wanted to sit in her kitchen and drink bad coffee and watch Schitt's Creek reruns and not set an alarm and not move things back to where I put them and not eat dinner off a counter while 2 people laughed in the next room. I wanted to be in a place where I didn't have to measure out how much space I was allowed to take up. I packed a bag that afternoon, not dramatically, not everything. Just what I needed for 4 days, jeans, my good sweater, the Christmas gifts I'd already wrapped for my parents, my laptop, my charger, my book. My mother-in-law passed me in the hallway while I was zipping up my duffel. "Oh," she said, "are you going somewhere?" "Red Deer," I said, "to see my mom." She looked at the bag. She looked at me. Something passed across her face that I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. "That's nice," she said. "Family is important." "It is," I said. My husband walked me to the car the next morning. It was -14 and the street was glazed with ice and the sky was that particular shade of Alberta winter white that means it might snow by noon. He stood with his arms crossed against the cold and he said, "I want to talk about this when you get back." "Sure," I said. "I think you're making a point." I put my bag in the trunk. I thought about what to say. I thought about the 6 days my father spent in our house, walking carefully, saying I don't want to intrude, eating soup alone in the living room because the television bothered my husband. I thought about the plate on the counter. I thought about, I guess that's fine. "I'm going to see my mom," I said. "That's all." He exhaled. His breath made a cloud in the cold air. "You know she's not going to be around forever," he said. "I know," I said. "Neither is mine." I got in the car. He stood in the driveway and I watched him in the rear-view mirror until I turned out of the cul-de-sac and he disappeared. And then I turned on the heat and put on the radio and drove north on Deerfoot and it started snowing, just like I thought it might, soft and even and quiet. My phone rang 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at noon. I was eating a sandwich at my mother's kitchen table, watching the snow come down outside the window, and I looked at his name on my screen and I let it ring. My mother, who had not asked me a single question since I arrived except whether I wanted tea, looked up from her crossword. "Everything okay?" she said. "Yeah," I said. "I'll call him back later." She nodded. She went back to her crossword. We sat there in the quiet of her kitchen and the snow kept falling and the radiator made its small clinking sound and I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not resolved, just room to breathe, room to take up the space you actually occupy without tallying the cost. I did talk to my husband when I got home on the 24th. We talked for a long time, actually, longer than we'd talked in months, maybe years. He said things I hadn't expected him to say. I said things I'd been holding for longer than I realized. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a resolution with a bow on it. It was a beginning of something harder and more honest than what we'd been doing before. I don't know how it ends yet. I'm still in it. What I know is this. I spent a lot of years thinking that keeping the peace was the same thing as making things good, that staying quiet was the same as being patient, that tolerating something without naming it meant it wasn't happening. My father, after his surgery, sent me a card in the mail, handwritten, which he never does. It said, "Thank you for making room for me. I know it wasn't easy. You've always been stronger than you let yourself be." I put it on the fridge, where I can see it from the kitchen counter. I see it every morning now. There's a card on my fridge right now. My dad wrote it by hand, which he almost never does. He said I'd always been stronger than I let myself be. I've read it a lot of times. I'm still not sure I believe it. But I think that's the point. You don't have to believe something about yourself before you start acting like it's true. For a long time, I thought the way I moved through my marriage was a form of patience. I told myself I was keeping the peace, that tolerating things quietly was the same as handling them well, that if I didn't name what was happening, it wasn't really happening. I think a lot of people do this. I think it's one of the quietest and most damaging things a person can do to themselves because it requires a kind of ongoing dishonesty that compounds over time. You get so good at smoothing things over that you lose track of what the surface was supposed to look like in the first place. What I understand now, slowly, imperfectly, is that real decency isn't passive. It's not just the absence of cruelty. It's something you have to actively choose and keep choosing, even when it costs you something. My father showed up to our house after heart surgery trying to take up as little space as possible. He said he didn't want to intrude. That broke something open in me that I hadn't known was closed. Because that man has never in his life made anyone feel like an intrusion. He has always made room. That's not an accident. That's a daily decision. That's what it actually looks like to treat people with dignity. Not the performance of it, but the practice. And I think the reason it took me so long to act on what I was seeing is that I hadn't yet trusted my own judgment enough to believe it. I kept looking for another explanation. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was reading into things. Maybe the plate on the counter instead of the table was just logistical, not what it felt like. But there's a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from overthinking. It comes from paying attention long enough and honestly enough that you finally stop explaining away what's right in front of you. That's what the drive to Red Deer was. Not a dramatic statement. Just me, finally, trusting what I knew. The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was the quiet in the car afterward. Because once you stop performing okayness, you have to sit with what's actually there. And what was there for me was grief, mostly. Not anger. Grief for the years I'd spent making myself smaller in a space I'd helped build. That's not nothing. That's worth sitting with. But here's what I also know. I drove back on the 24th. I had the hard conversation. I'm still in it. That's the part nobody tells you, that the brave thing isn't always the clean exit. Sometimes the brave thing is staying in the difficulty with your eyes open instead of your eyes closed. Showing up honestly when it's easier to perform. Saying the true thing when the comfortable thing is right there, available, tempting. My dad sent that card 2 weeks after he got home. He's doing well. He walked 2 kilometers yesterday. He texted me with a little maple leaf emoji at the end. I kept the card. I'm keeping it.